The carvings on that cave wall moved between one glance and the next, stone figures shifting posture in the dark, while something scaled and upright stood in the gap we had come in through, watching us with the stillness of a thing that had been waiting since before this country had a name. My name is Russell Adler. I am 34 years old. I am giving this statement under oath to this inquest on the 14th of September, 1926, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I understand that the formal matter before this board concerns a disputed mineral claim filed by the Southwestern Land Survey Office out of Santa Fe, for which I was employed as lead prospector and field supervisor. I will address that claim, but I am asking this board to hear what I am about to say in full before anyone decides what portion of it belongs in the record, because I have spent 6 weeks trying to find the right institution to tell this to, and a mineral inquest is not what I had in mind. It is, however, what I have been given. I will say at the outset that I am not a man who frightens easily, and I am not a man who invents. I spent 11 years working mineral surveys across Arizona, Nevada, and the territory that is now the eastern reach of New Mexico. I have worked claim jumper country. I have worked flooded shafts. I have been 3 days without water in the Chihuahuan Desert and kept my notes current throughout. I am telling you what happened in that formation north of the Sacramento Mountains because something is living in it, and because a man named Aldous Crane went into it and did not come back out, and because the single piece of physical evidence I brought out of that cave was taken from me at this office's front desk by a federal land agent whose name I was not given, and I would like to know where it went. We entered the cave on the morning of April the 3rd, 1926. I want to be clear about how it began, because the beginning matters. This was not a reckless expedition. We were not amateurs chasing legend. We were a contracted survey team, 3 men, operating under a standard mineral assessment order for a sandstone formation that had been flagged in a preliminary geological map produced the previous autumn. The assignment was routine: assess the formation for usable mineral deposit, take measurements, file a report. The survey office paid by the mile and expected nothing unusual. The 3 of us were myself, Aldous Crane, who was our junior surveyor and the youngest of the party at 26, and Martin Follows, who served as our pack handler and camp keeper, and who had been working the high desert survey routes for nearly as long as I had, though in a different capacity. Martin was not a draftsman or a technician. He was the man who kept the animals fed and the equipment functional, and who had an instinct for terrain that I have never seen matched in a formally trained geologist. He could read a hillside the way some men read a ledger. When Martin Follows said a formation was unstable, you moved camp. When he said a dry bed had recent water in it, you dug. That instinct is the only reason I am sitting in this room, instead of somewhere else entirely. Aldous Crane I will describe more carefully, because this board needs to understand who he was before they can understand what happened to him. He was not reckless. He was not prone to fantasy. He had graduated from the New Mexico College of Agriculture and Mechanic Arts 2 years prior with a concentration in land survey and applied geology, and he was, by any fair measure, one of the most technically precise young men I had worked with. He did meticulous work. He kept better field notes than men twice his experience. He was quiet, methodical, and skeptical in the way that educated young men often are, the kind of skeptical that sometimes reads as arrogance, but in Crane's case was simply habit. He did not believe things without evidence. He said so often, it was almost a point of pride with him. I mention all of this because I want you to understand that when Aldous Crane walked toward that rear passage in a calm voice and told us something was showing him where to go, it was not in character. It was not in any character I had ever observed in the man across 3 survey seasons. That is the detail I keep returning to. Not what I saw on the walls, though I will get to that. Not what was standing in the cave mouth. The thing that has not left me in 6 weeks is the sound of Crane's voice in that passage, flat and unhurried, describing directions he was receiving from a source he either could not or would not name. But I am moving ahead. The board asked me to begin at the beginning. I will try. We reached the formation on the evening of April the 2nd after a 2-day approach from our base camp near the dry fork of a creek that does not appear on any map I have seen with a name attached to it, though the local survey designates it as Drainage Basin 714. The terrain in that area is high desert sandstone country, broken mesas and collapsed bluff faces, dry arroyos cut 10 and 15 feet deep by flash water that has not run in living memory. The vegetation is sparse, juniper and pinyon at the higher elevations, creosote and sparse grama grass in the lower basins. It is country that looks empty and feels inhabited, if that distinction means anything to this board. Martin had found the formation's coordinates in the preliminary map the survey office provided, but the map was imprecise in the way that aerial approximations always are. What it showed as a continuous sandstone bluff was in reality a series of collapsed sections, some fallen inward, some outward, with debris fields spread across the arroyo floor below. We spent the afternoon of the 2nd walking the base of the bluff, looking for the access point the preliminary survey had noted, which was described only as a natural opening in the western face, approximate dimensions unknown. We found it at roughly 4 in the afternoon. It was not what I expected. The cave mouth was narrow. I measured it later at approximately 22 inches at its widest point, which is barely wide enough to enter sideways if you are a man of ordinary build. The edges were smooth in a way that sandstone does not naturally smooth itself. I noticed that even then, standing outside in the late afternoon light, because smooth edges on a desert cave mouth usually mean long water action, and this arroyo had not carried significant water in a very long time. The smoothing on those edges was not from water. I could not tell you what it was from. I noted it in my field book and moved on. The bluff face above the opening was unremarkable at first glance. Sandstone, red-brown and layered, with the typical wind-cut striations you see all through that formation. But Martin, who had been running his eye up the face while I examined the opening, said something that I wrote down verbatim because it struck me as odd. He said the rock above the opening had been painted over at some point, and that the paint was old enough to have nearly merged with the stone, but that the color was wrong. The surface read as plain sandstone, until the late afternoon light hit it at a low enough angle, and then he could see the edge of something beneath the weathered surface. A boundary line, the kind of marking that is meant to be visible only to people who are already looking. I looked where he was pointing. He was right. In the raking light I could see a faint border, a rectangular margin pressed into the stone face, perhaps 8 feet wide and 10 feet tall, framing the cave opening as if it were a doorway. The markings inside the border had been worn nearly to nothing. I could not read them, but the border itself was deliberate, and it was old, and someone had gone to considerable effort to make it blend into the surrounding rock when seen from any angle but the one we happened to be standing at. Crane had his notebook out. He was already sketching. He said it looked pre-Puebloan, and that the survey office would want a proper documentation team out here once we filed. He said it the way he said most things, matter-of-factly, professionally, without a great deal of inflection. I agreed with him on the documentation point. I told Martin to note the coordinates. We made camp 40 yards from the cave mouth that evening. I want to say plainly that nothing unusual happened on the night of April the 2nd. The temperature was ordinary for early spring in that elevation, dropping to perhaps 40 degrees after dark. The horses were settled. We ate, reviewed the next day's plan, and slept without incident. I am telling you this so that you understand we did not enter that cave already frightened, or already inclined toward the sort of experience we ended up having. We went in the next morning, as professionals on a routine assignment. What happened inside changed that, and it changed it quickly, but it did not begin that way. We entered at approximately 8 in the morning on April 3rd. The opening, as I said, required us to enter sideways. I went first, then Crane, then Martin, who had the most difficulty because of his frame. We each carried a kerosene lantern of the standard survey type, a 4-inch globe with a tin reflector. Crane had his survey tools, his notebook, and the canvas roll he used for rubbings. Martin carried the secondary kit, spare fuel, rope, the measuring tape. The first thing I noticed on the other side of the opening was the size of the space. I had expected a shallow cave. The entrance and the formation type suggested perhaps 30 or 40 feet of depth before you hit the back wall, which is typical for that kind of bluff face opening. What I stepped into was something considerably larger. The ceiling was too high for the lanterns to illuminate clearly. I held mine up, and the light simply faded into darkness above a certain point, which my later measurements suggested was somewhere between 30 and 40 feet overhead. The floor was flat and smooth, which is unusual, and extended back into the rock in a way I could not immediately gauge. I took 3 steps in and stopped, holding the lantern out, and I tried to establish the dimensions of the space before we moved further. That is when I saw the walls. I am going to describe this carefully, and I am asking this board to hold its questions until I am finished, because what I am about to say requires the full context to make sense. The walls of that cave, from the floor to as high as the lantern light would carry, were covered in carved figures. Every surface, the left wall, the right wall, what I could see of the rear wall at the limits of the light. The carvings were uniform in execution, which is the first thing that registered. I have seen Puebloan pictographs and petroglyphs across a significant portion of the Southwest, and they vary. They vary in depth, in technique, in the steadiness of the cutting line. What I was looking at did not vary. Every figure was cut to the same depth, which I later measured at approximately 3/8 of an inch. Every line was clean. The figures were arranged in horizontal registers, like text on a page, running all the way around the space, and they were separated from one another by thin, incised lines that acted as borders between registers. I want you to understand the scale of what I am describing. This was not a handful of images on a notable surface, the kind of thing you see documented in archaeological surveys. This was thousands of figures, arranged systematically, covering every available inch of stone on every wall of a space that was, by my rough estimate, perhaps 60 feet wide and at least as deep, with a ceiling height of 30 to 40 feet. If this were writing, and I am not prepared to say it was, it would represent an enormous document. If it were decorative, the effort required to produce it was beyond anything I am aware of in any tradition associated with this region. Martin had come in behind me by then and was standing at my right shoulder. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, that we should get our measurements and go. I noted his tone. Martin Follows was not a man who expressed discomfort often. When he did, there was usually a reason. Crane had moved to the nearest wall and was already examining the lower registers with his lantern held close. He called back to us that the cutting technique was unlike anything he had encountered in his training, and that the figures in the lowest band were not consistent with any Puebloan, Mogollon, or ancestral Puebloan tradition he had studied. He used the word anomalous 3 times in the first 5 minutes. He was already taking notes. I will describe the figures as I saw them, starting at the lowest register, because that is the portion of the carvings that is most directly relevant to what I need to report to this board. The lowest band of carvings, running at a height between 1 foot and 3 feet from the floor, depicted 2 types of figures. The first type was immediately recognizable as human. The proportions were correct. 2 arms, 2 legs, upright posture, heads of appropriate size. These figures were rendered at a scale of roughly 6 inches in height within the carving. They were depicted in postures that I can only describe as prone or subservient, lying flat, bowed forward, kneeling with the head inclined toward the ground. They were arranged in rows beneath the second type of figure. The second type was not human. I want to be precise here because this is the central fact of what I am reporting. The second type of figure was upright and bipedal, meaning it stood on 2 legs, but it was not human in its proportions. It was depicted at roughly twice the scale of the human figures, placing it at approximately 12 inches within the carving, which at the proportional scale suggested a real-world height of somewhere between 8 and 10 feet. The limbs were elongated, particularly the arms, which extended below what would be the midpoint of the thigh in a human figure. The head was large, somewhat flattened at the top, with features that I find difficult to describe without sounding as though I am embellishing, and I am not embellishing. The features suggested a wide mouth, set eyes, and what I can only describe as a scaled or plated texture across the jawline, neck, and shoulders. The figures were depicted in standing postures, upright, unbowed, and they were positioned above the rows of human forms in a way that I will call supervisory for lack of a better word. That is the word I used in my field notes, and it is the word I will use here. The relationship between the two types of figure, the scaled upright beings and the prostrate humans, was not ambiguous. It was arranged, deliberate, and consistent across the entire lower register of every wall in that cave. I am a prospector. I am not an archaeologist. I am not a historian. I know what I saw. Crane confirmed my reading of the figures within about 15 minutes of his own examination. He did not seem disturbed by this. He seemed fascinated. He said the figures were rendered with an anatomical specificity that implied either direct observation or an artistic tradition with detailed anatomical knowledge, and that either explanation was remarkable. He said we needed rubbings. He unrolled his canvas cloth and got to work. Martin had moved toward the center of the cave floor and was pacing the space, measuring by stride, which was his habit when the formal tape was not yet deployed. He called back to me after a few minutes and said the floor was not natural, by which he meant it had been worked. The flatness was not geological. Something had leveled it. He said the surface felt like it had been finished, the way a stone floor is finished, not laid like masonry, but smoothed and compressed in a way that suggested it had been done deliberately and done a very long time ago. That was the first forward sign of what I will come to later. The floor had been prepared. Whatever this space was, it had been built for occupancy, and whatever built it had wanted the floor level. I will come back to why that detail matters. I have mentioned that Crane was taking rubbings. I want to describe the one that survived, because this board has been told a rubbing was surrendered at this office's door, and I want the record to reflect exactly what was on it. Crane pressed canvas cloth against the lowest section of the right-hand wall, roughly 2 feet from the floor, and he rubbed it with his charcoal block in the standard technique. The section he chose was a single figure in the lower register, one of the scaled upright beings, standing alone rather than in a grouping, which Crane said made it easier to capture cleanly. The figure in the rubbing showed, with considerable clarity, the scaled torso and elongated limbs I described above. The most significant element was what was positioned beneath the figure in the carving. Not a row of prostrate human forms, as in most of the lower register, but a single human figure, kneeling with both arms extended outward and upward, in a posture that Crane described in his field notes as offering or presentation. The rubbing captured this with enough clarity that even a layman could read the relational hierarchy. Something was being presented, or surrendered, or given over, and the direction of that exchange was from human to the figure above. Crane said it looked instructional, that it was the kind of image you put somewhere to show people what to do. I agreed with him, and I wish I had taken that observation more seriously in the moment. Let me now describe the cave as it was approximately 2 hours into our survey, because the conditions changed, and the change was abrupt enough that I documented it in my field notes at the time it occurred. We had been working systematically. Crane was moving along the right wall, taking rubbings of selected sections and making sketches in his notebook. I was doing formal measurements, pacing the length and width of the main chamber and taking ceiling height estimates using a string and weight device I carry for shaft work. Martin was examining the floor in detail and had found 2 areas where it appeared to have been repaired at some point, the fills slightly different in color from the surrounding stone, suggesting maintenance over a considerable period of time. The main chamber terminated at its rear in a wall that was, unlike the carved walls on the sides, largely plain. It had a few marks on it, but nothing like the density of the side walls. and in the lower center of this rear wall, there was a passage opening, narrower than the entry, perhaps 16 inches wide, and low, perhaps 5 feet in height, meaning you would need to duck to enter it. It was dark. The lantern light did not reach far into it. None of us had approached that passage in the first 2 hours. I was aware of it, but had not yet prioritized it. We were still working the main chamber, which had more than enough material to document. I note this because I want the board to understand that none of us were drawn to that passage immediately. We saw it, and we did not go to it. That is important. At approximately 10 in the morning, the temperature inside the cave dropped. I know that sounds like the kind of detail a person adds after the fact to make a story more dramatic. I documented it in real time. My field notes for April 3rd have an entry that reads, 10:12, significant temperature drop, no draft, fuel consumption unchanged, estimating 15-degree change in 15 minutes. I carry a small mercury thermometer in my kit, because temperature changes in enclosed underground spaces can indicate ventilation issues relevant to safety assessment. I took a reading. We had been working in approximately 58 degrees Fahrenheit. The reading at 10:12 was 43. There was no wind. The lanterns were not guttering in any draft. The air was still. Martin felt it first. He had been kneeling to examine a section of the floor, and he stood up and turned toward the rear of the cave without saying anything. I noticed him turn, and I looked in the same direction. The rear wall and its passage were at the limit of our combined lantern light. I could not see anything unusual. Then I noticed the lantern flames. They were narrowing, all 3 of them, simultaneously, contracting toward the wick in the way that a lantern flame contracts when the oxygen is being depleted. But we were not in a sealed space. The cave mouth was open behind us. There was no mechanism for oxygen depletion that I could identify. The flames were thin, and the quality of the light had changed. It had taken on a slight yellowish cast, which is the color a kerosene flame turns when something is wrong with the air. I said to the others that we should collect what we had and move toward the entrance. I said it calmly. I want the board to know that. I was not panicking. I was making a practical assessment of a changed environment. Crane said he needed 10 more minutes. I told him we had what we needed and that we could return with a documentation team. I said we should note the coordinates carefully and submit the find to the survey office through the proper channel, which I genuinely meant at the time, though I understand now that proper channels may not be the right frame for what that cave contains. Martin had not moved from where he was standing. He was looking at the rear wall. I turned back to look at it myself. The carvings on the rear wall had changed. I am going to state that plainly and let the board make of it what they will. I had spent 2 hours in that cave and I had studied those walls carefully, including the rear wall. The marks I had seen on the rear wall in the first pass were sparse, clustered near the ceiling, and largely abstract, which is why I had not prioritized them for documentation. When I looked at the rear wall at 10:12, the lower portion of that wall had figures on it that had not been there before. Figures in the same incised style as the rest of the carvings, the same depth, the same cut quality. New registers of scaled upright figures, positioned above a row of small human forms. Where before there had been plain stone in the lower 6 feet of the rear wall, there were now carvings. I am aware of how this sounds. I am aware that there is no mechanism by which stone carvings appear on a wall in the middle of a morning while 3 men are standing in the same room. I am not offering an explanation. I am telling you what I saw and what I documented. My field notes from that moment say, rear wall figures, lower register, not previously present, no explanation. That is the entry, verbatim. I have written worse surprises in field notes and kept a steady hand. I kept a steady hand, but Martin had seen it too. He told me later, when we were back at camp, that he had noticed it 2 or 3 minutes before I had, and that he had been standing still waiting to see if they would change again. He said they did not change while he watched. They only changed between looks. You would look at a section of the wall and see one configuration of figures, and then look away and look back, and the configuration would be different. Not dramatically different. A figure that had been standing with its arms at its sides now had one arm raised. A row of human forms that had been oriented facing left was now facing right. The changes were small, precise, and they only happened in the gaps between direct observation. I will say something about this that I have thought about considerably in the 6 weeks since. The walls were a record of something. I do not know if they were history, or instruction, or communication. But whatever they were not static. They were being updated. I do not know by what mechanism, and I will not speculate beyond what I observed. What I observed was that the carvings changed when we were not looking directly at them, and that the changes brought the figures on the rear wall, the scaled bipedal figures, closer to the center of the compositional space, and the human figures into postures that more closely resembled the prostrate and offering postures in the lower registers on the side walls. It was Crane who first moved toward the rear passage. I want to be fair to him, because I do not think he was acting without reason from his own perspective. I think he saw what was happening and interpreted it as an invitation rather than a warning, which is a reasonable difference of interpretation, and a fatal one. He had been working the right-hand wall near the rear of the chamber when the temperature dropped, and when the carvings on the rear wall began to show what they showed, he was closer to that passage than Martin or I were. He walked toward it without announcement. He just moved. I saw him move and I called his name. He turned around. He looked at me. His face was perfectly calm. He said, "There is another chamber." I told him we were leaving. I said it firmly. He said, "Something is showing me where to go." I crossed the distance between us in perhaps 4 strides, and I put my hand on his arm. He did not resist me, but he also did not move away from the passage. He was looking into it. The lantern light went only a few feet into the opening. Beyond a few feet it was completely black, which is the kind of black you only get underground when there is significant depth and no reflected light source from any direction. Whatever was in there, it was deep. I said his name again. I pulled his arm. He allowed me to pull him back perhaps 3 steps, and then he stopped moving and said again, very quietly, very flat, that something was in there, and it was showing him where to go. He did not say it like a man who was afraid. He said it like a man reading directions off a signpost. Informational. Certain. Martin had come up beside me by then. He had not said anything. He looked at Crane, looked at the passage, and then looked at me, and the look he gave me was the one I mentioned earlier, the one Martin Follows used when a formation was genuinely unstable and it was time to move. He did not wait for my instruction. He took Crane's other arm. Between the two of us, we moved Crane back across the chamber toward the cave mouth. He did not fight us. He walked. But he kept looking back toward the rear passage, and his expression did not change the whole way, calm and distant, and not quite present, in a way that was unlike anything I had ever seen in him across 3 seasons of field work. I did not look at the walls as we crossed toward the entrance. I want to be honest about that. I looked straight ahead at the cave mouth, and I did not look at the walls. Martin did the same. Whatever the carvings were doing in our peripheral vision, I did not want to see it directly, and I will not pretend otherwise. We were perhaps 20 feet from the cave mouth when I heard a sound. It was not a crack or a rumble. It was quieter than that. It was the particular sound of loose stone settling under weight, a dry sliding, the kind of sound that scree makes when something crosses it. It came from the direction of the cave mouth. I looked up. The opening was narrower than it had been. Not by a great deal, not sealed, but there was fresh stone on the floor to either side of the opening, angular rubble that had not been there when we entered, and the gap was perhaps 15 inches across, where it had been 22. I measured this later with the tape. The stone that had fallen was dry. When I knelt and looked at the debris, there was no dust on it, which means it had not been displaced recently in the conventional sense. Fresh falls raise dust. The air in a cave settles fine particulate within minutes of any significant collapse. There was no dust. I looked at the edges of the new gap. The break lines in the stone were not fresh. The color of the exposed rock at the break points was as weathered as the surrounding surface, which is not possible if the stone had fallen within the last hour. It is simply not possible. I did not say this to Martin. I filed it, and I kept moving, and then I looked into the shadow of the narrowed opening. There was something standing there. It was in the shadow of the opening, pressed against the right side of the gap, and the lantern light did not reach it fully. I could see its outline. I could see that it was tall, taller than a man, and that it was upright. I could see that the surface of its skin, or what I take to have been its skin, had a quality that was not like human skin. It did not reflect light the way skin does. It absorbed the lantern light in a way that made its surface read as textured, ridged, scaled. The jaw and neck, which were the portions closest to the light, had a structure that I recognized immediately because I had been staring at its carved representation on those walls for 2 hours. It was looking at us. I do not know how to describe its expression, and I am not certain the word expression is appropriate to what I saw. Its face was still. Its eyes were not in shadow the way the rest of it was, and I will say plainly that the eyes were not human eyes. They were pale, very pale, almost colorless in the lantern light, and they were steady in a way that suggested they were not processing us the way a startled animal processes a threat. It was not startled. It was not alarmed. It was not moving toward us or away from us. It was standing in the gap of its own cave mouth, looking at 3 men who had come inside without invitation and spent 4 hours taking rubbings of its walls. Patient is the wrong word. I know someone used that word and I understand why, but patience implies waiting for something you want. What I saw was not waiting. It was regarding. It was taking stock. It had the quality of attention that a senior man gives to a junior one who has made an error, before deciding what consequence to assign. That is the closest I can come to describing what its posture communicated. Martin said, "Go." I pushed Crane toward the gap first. He went through it with some resistance, still looking back over his shoulder toward the rear of the cave. But he went. I followed immediately. Sideways through the gap, the stone pressing against my back and chest, the shadow of the figure to my right, and close enough that I could have extended my arm and touched it if I had done something as stupid as extending my arm. I did not. I came through the gap and into the desert light with my eyes shut and kept moving. I heard Martin come through behind me. I did not stop walking. None of us did. We went down the arroyo slope and across the dry creek bed and up the far bank, and we did not stop until we had covered perhaps 100 yards. Then I turned around. Crane was not behind us. I want to say clearly that he had been ahead of me through the gap. He had gone first. He was in front of me when I came through the cave mouth. The distance from the cave mouth to where Martin and I were standing was perhaps 100 yards of open arroyo. There is nowhere to go in that arroyo except along it or back into the cave. There is no cover, no side channel, nothing. It is an open, flat-floored wash between 2 sandstone walls. Crane was not in it. He was not visible in any direction. Martin and I looked at each other and then both looked back at the cave mouth. The opening appeared as we had left it, 15-inch gap, loose stone on either side, no figure visible in it, no Crane visible in it. The arroyo in both directions was empty. I will not pretend that I processed this calmly. I did not. I shouted his name a number of times. Martin did the same. We stood at the 100-yard mark and shouted, and waited, and nothing came back. There was no answer. There was no movement at the cave mouth. There was no sound from inside that I could detect at that distance. The desert was very quiet, and the sky was very bright, and Aldous Crane was simply not present in any direction. I know what the board will ask here. I know that the natural question is why we did not go back in. I will answer it directly. We did not go back in because whatever was in that cave had just demonstrated that it could alter its own entrance, that it could change the carvings on its walls in real time, that it had drawn one of my men toward a rear passage using a mechanism I cannot identify, and that it had positioned itself in the opening between us and the outside world. Going back in would have been a decision to place ourselves once more inside a space that entity controlled entirely, in the hope of recovering a man who had been, by any reasonable reading of the evidence, taken or kept by the thing that owned the space. I made the calculation that going back in would not recover Crane and would cost the remaining 2 men as well. I made that calculation, and I made it fast, and I have made peace with it in the time since, or I have tried to. We went back to camp. I am going to describe the next several hours because they bear on the record of this account. We reached camp at approximately noon. Martin unsaddled and watered the horses. I sat at the camp table and wrote out my field notes in full while the morning was still immediate, because I knew then, as I know now, that this account would need to be as complete and as contemporaneous as I could make it. I wrote for approximately 2 hours. Everything I have told this board today, I wrote in those 2 hours at the camp table north of the Sacramento Mountains with the sandstone bluff visible in the distance. At approximately 2 in the afternoon, I walked back toward the bluff, not to the cave. I went to the base of the arroyo, to the point where the approach path curved and the cave mouth would be visible if you were on the floor of the wash. I stood at that curve and I looked at the cave mouth from a distance of perhaps 40 yards. The entrance was fully open again. 22 inches, as it had been when we arrived. No loose stone visible on either side of the opening. The debris that had partially blocked it was gone. I did not go closer. I went back to camp and told Martin what I had seen. He had nothing to add. We broke camp the following morning and began the return to base. We did not speak about it much during the return journey, which took 2 days. Martin spoke once, on the second evening, and said that he thought whatever was in that cave had allowed us to leave on the understanding that one of us was staying. I did not respond to this because I did not know what to say to it, and I still do not. We reached the base camp at the Dry Fork on April 5th. I filed a preliminary field report with the survey office by telegraph on April 6th, which I kept deliberately vague. I said we had found a cave system of significant archaeological interest, and that one member of the party had become separated from the group and was unaccounted for. I said we had been unable to effect a recovery, and that a search would require a larger team with proper preparation. I did not say what I have said here today, because I did not know who to say it to, or whether anyone would believe it, or whether saying it would produce any useful action. I am still not entirely certain on that last point, but Crane's family has not been given an explanation, and the survey office has not been given a complete account, and I am unwilling to let the record stand as it currently does. I said I would come back to the smoothed floor, and I will do that now, because Martin's observation about it connects to something that I have thought about during the 6 weeks between April 3rd and today. That floor had been prepared for use, not for storage, not for shelter in the conventional sense. A level floor in a space that large, with that ceiling height, suggests an inhabited space, a space that something returns to. The carvings cover every surface, floor to ceiling, and they depict a consistent relational arrangement, scaled bipedal beings above or in authority over human figures. The lowest registers, which would be at human eye level for most people entering the space, show the most direct and explicit versions of this arrangement. The postures of the human figures in those registers are instructional, as Crane said. They show what is expected. I have thought about what it would mean if those carvings are a record of regular contact. Not ancient contact, not mythological contact, but practical and ongoing contact between whatever lives in that formation and the human populations of the region across whatever stretch of time it has occupied it. The carvings did not read as warning. They did not read as worship. They read as instruction. Here is what occurs here. Here is how it works. Here is what you do. We did not do any of those things. We went in without knowledge, took what we could, and tried to leave with it. And we lost a man. I do not know if the other pre-contact peoples who knew about that cave, and I think some did, I think the boundary markings on the bluff face confirm that somebody knew about it. I do not know if they had an arrangement, a protocol, a way of entering and leaving that was acceptable to whatever occupies that space. I do not know what the prostrate figures in the carvings represent in practical terms, whether it was tribute or ceremony or simply the posture of acknowledged inferiority. I do not know what was surrendered at the feet of those scaled figures in the offering register that Crane rubbed, or whether surrendering it was a choice or a compulsion. What I know is that we took a rubbing of those figures without asking, and without understanding what they represented, and that we attempted to leave with it, and that the cave narrowed its own entrance to prevent our leaving, and that something stood in that entrance, and that Crane did not come out. I will describe the figure at the entrance once more, because I want to be sure the record has this clearly. It was tall. I estimate between 8 and 9 feet, based on the portion I could see against the opening, which I have measured. It was bipedal and upright. The skin or surface was not smooth. It was ridged and textured, in a way consistent with the scaled depiction in the carvings. The neck and jaw showed the most clearly, and they showed exactly what the carvings had been depicting for what I have to assume is a very long time. The eyes were pale and still and direct, and it held itself with the assurance of something that does not experience threat. It did not move toward us. It did not vocalize. It stood in the entrance of its own space and it looked at us, and we left, and Crane stayed. I have asked myself many times since whether its stillness was a gesture of restraint or of indifference, whether it allowed us to leave because we were not worth pursuing or because the cost of our departure had already been settled. I cannot answer this. I was there, and I cannot answer it. Martin Follows has not spoken publicly about this event, and I will not speak for him. He has returned to fieldwork in the Arizona Territory as of last month. He told me before he left that he thinks about Crane every morning and that he has no intention of returning to that formation. He said it the way Martin says things, simply and without drama, and that is all he said about it. I want to address something before I close this deposition. There is going to be a question about Crane's state of mind and whether what happened to him was voluntary. I want to answer that clearly. What I observed in Crane's behavior during those final minutes in the cave was not consistent with any mental or emotional state I had seen in him before. He was not excited. He was not afraid. He was not confused. He was simply certain in a way that had no prior basis in his character. Something had changed in how he was processing his situation, and it had changed very recently, and it had changed in the direction of compliance. Whether that compliance was a form of control, a form of communication, or something I have no framework to describe, I cannot say. What I can say is that the Aldous Crane who walked toward that rear passage was not behaving as the Aldous Crane I had worked with for 3 years, and that the change in him coincided precisely with the temperature drop and the narrowing of the lantern flames and the new figures appearing on the rear wall. I believe he went into that passage. I believe he went into it willingly, or in a state that functioned as willingness. I do not believe he was destroyed in any ordinary sense, because I have no evidence of that. I have no evidence of him at all after the moment I came through the cave mouth and turned around. He was simply not in the arroyo. The most complete interpretation of the available facts is that he went back into the cave through the rear passage, that the cave holds that passage, and that the cave mouth opened again after we left because it had received what it intended to receive when it narrowed in the first place. The canvas rubbing was in my kit when I returned to base camp on April 5th. I carried it throughout the return because Crane had put it in the main kit bag rather than his personal roll, which meant it traveled with the equipment rather than with the man who made it. I brought it to the survey office on April 8th when I made my formal report. A federal land agent whose name I requested but was not given was present at the survey office when I arrived and asked to see the rubbing before I had spoken about it. I do not know how he knew to ask. I showed it to him. He examined it for approximately 10 minutes. He said he would need to retain it as part of the documentation of the incident. I asked what incident he was referring to, given that I had only filed a preliminary and incomplete report. He said it was a matter of federal land record. He took the rubbing. I have not seen it since, and the survey office has told me it has no record of the retention. I have given this board my full account. I have told it as accurately as my field notes and my memory allow. I am asking this board to enter it into a record that will outlast whatever decision is made in this room today about the mineral claim, because I think there are people who should know that what is in that formation is not a historical curiosity and is not an archaeological artifact. It is present. It is there now. It was there when those carvings were made, and it was there when we walked into its space 4 hours without an invitation, and it is there still, and if anyone intends to go back into that arroyo and enter that cave, I am asking them as plainly as I know how to ask anything. Do not go in to take. Do not go in with the assumption that what is in there is below you or beneath your authority or subject to your curiosity. It has been in that place since before anyone built anything in this territory. It has records on its walls that are longer than anything in any library I know of, and it has made its own record of what happens when humans enter its space, without understanding what that entry means. Aldous Crane is that record now. I do not know if he is alive. I do not know what the rear chamber holds. I do not know what the figures in the offering register were depicting as tribute or surrender, or whether Crane constitutes one more item in a very long accounting. I know that he walked through a passage in the back of a cave in the high desert north of the Sacramento Mountains on the morning of April the 3rd, 1926, and that he did not walk back out, and that what stood in the entrance and watched us leave had the look of something that considered the exchange settled. The rubbing is gone. My field notes are here, and I will surrender a copy to this board. The cave is exactly where I have described it to be. The coordinates are in my notes. I am asking whoever holds those coordinates next to consider carefully whether curiosity is worth what it costs, because I can tell you from where I am sitting that the answer is not what I thought it was before April 3rd of this year. Whatever lives in that formation has developed, over a span of time I cannot estimate, a very clear position on human beings who come into its space and take things without permission. The carvings say so plainly if you read the figures in the right order. I read them in the wrong order, and by the time I read them correctly, we were already at the cave mouth. I do not know what Crane saw in that rear passage. I have spent 6 weeks wishing I did. I have spent 6 weeks wishing he had simply come through the gap ahead of me and walked up that arroyo and been standing next to Martin when I turned around. I spend time on that image. It is a comfortable image. It is not what happened. What happened is in this record. If this board asks me whether I believe in what I saw, I will say what I should have said the moment I walked into that cave and saw those walls. I did not believe in things like this before April 3rd, 1926. I was precise and practical, and I required evidence. I required evidence, and the cave gave me more evidence than I know what to do with, and I came home with none of it. And a man did not come home at all. I believe now. That is not comfort. Belief does not bring Crane back, and it does not make me feel that I understand what I encountered in that cave. It only means I cannot look at this landscape the same way anymore. The Sacramento Mountains, to the south of that arroyo, look different to me now than they did in March. They look occupied. They look like they have always been occupied. And I think whatever occupies them has been watching the human activity in this territory for a very long time, with the same still, pale, assessing eyes that watched me come through a narrowed cave mouth in the spring of 1926 and decide not to follow. The next surveying team that goes into that formation will not be forewarned by anything in the official record, because the official record has been reduced to a disputed mineral claim and a retained rubbing that no one is naming. So I am warning you here, and I am warning you plainly, and I am asking that these words stay in some record somewhere, that a man with surveying boots and a lantern and an assignment might one day find. Whatever is in that cave has an arrangement with the territory that predates anything we have built here. Do not go in to take. Do not go in to document without knowing what documentation means in that space. And if the figures on those walls are still changing between glances, and I believe they are, if the lowest register is still depicting what it was depicting on the morning I was standing in front of it, then you will already know, before you reach the rear wall, exactly what that space expects from you. Walk back out through the gap while the gap still exists. That is everything I have to say.